Greg Stewart. Greg is a very interesting man. He's a trance medium, healer, and lecturer committed to sharing his experience and knowledge of mediumship to believers and non believers from all spiritual and religious backgrounds. After traveling extensively to Brazil to visit some of the world's greatest spiritual centers, Greg learned Portuguese so that he could build bridges between the two cultures and deepen his spiritual understanding. At a time when the American culture is just beginning to get exposed to more psychic phenomena in the spirit world from the media and Ghostbuster style television shows, Greg's committed to sharing his knowledge through a series of lectures such as What It Means to Be Spiritual. Greg and his wife Thania are also active in a charitable non-profit group called Brazilian Spiritual Healing, which is a popular healing circle in Northern California. Thanks to other mediums, healers, and friends that support Brazilian spiritual healing, Greg and Thania are able to demonstrate a type of trance mediumship that's very rare in the United States, the channeling of spirit doctors for the purpose of healing. If you'd like more information about Greg and Thania, please visit their wonderful Facebook page at facebook.com/Brazilian Spiritual Healing. Well, Greg, good evening and welcome to the show.
Good evening, Steve. It's so nice to be here.
It's wonderful to have you with us,
and
Greg.
Hello, everyone else.
It was great to speak with you last week in advance of the show, and I know that you've got a lot of very interesting knowledge and experiences to share with our listeners. Well, Greg,
Well,
my first question for you is, how did you first become interested in trance mediumship and healing?
Well, Steve, I'd like to say this was by accident, but I'm sure that most of your panel there, most of your listeners will agree that nothing in life seems to happen by accident. But I lived, almost my entire adult and professional life, and then during a series of events, one which was a painful divorce, and another one was buying a business 3,000 miles away from my home on the East Coast. During the time, I was very vulnerable. And I received an invitation from a friend who wanted me to escort her to Brazil to see the famous healer, John of God. And so that began this journey. And it seemed to come out of left field for me because it was a time in my life when I was busy trying to develop a new business. I had not heard from this friend in approximately a year. And when she asked me if I could, sit with her on the plane, and I said, well, why do you want me to do this? He said, well, I'm dying of cervical cancer, and I really feel that I need to go and see this healer, and I think you're the person who should go and accompany me for the trip. Well, I knew I was going to say no, but I told her I would sleep on it so that the next morning when I woke up, I'd have a list of 50 really good reasons why I wouldn't be going to Brazil with her. And in that moment, Steve, it was what I believe was one of my first recognized mediumistic experiences. I literally heard a voice. It was not a dream. I was fully awake. I was fully conscious, even though I was still in bed, just waking up. And the voice said very, very sternly, in a loving manner, go to Brazil. And before I could stop my hand from reaching for the telephone, I called her and said, okay, I'll go with you. And the next thing you know, in 3 weeks, she had the tickets arranged, and we were in Brazil. And this happened in October 2003. It was sitting in Brazil with the healer in what they call the current room, which is the room where John of God has his big platform rocker, and he sits and attends all the people, sometimes up to 1,000 people a day, that I begin to have these mediumistic experiences. Now, what I've learned in the past 10 years in retrospect, is that something to do with being around other mediums, because there's many mediums from all over the world that go there and also healers, sitting in the energy of the other healers, the energy of the spirits, and this current that's so important for the healing work that John of God does. This tended to open up what we call my chakras. And even though I'd had experiences with mediumship as a child, I didn't recognize what they were because, as most of you are aware, particularly when I was born in 1958, much of our culture at that time did not support mediumship and even psychic phenomena. So I had experiences, but I didn't recognize that's where they were. So here, many years later, sitting in this environment, I became open, and it was a whole brand new world to me. And so a lot of what I've learned over the last 9, 10 years has been trying to catch up to explain some of my own experiences and try to put the pieces together, as I call it, connect the dots.
Well, that's really interesting, Greg. Greg, you mentioned John of God at the beginning, and I know that you explained a little to me about John of God when we spoke on the telephone last week. But I wanted to ask if you could explain about John of God to our listeners, because that's a really fascinating part of the story as well.
Well, John of God he's considered one of Brazil's most accomplished and well-known trance mediums. He's been doing this, I would have to say, for more than 50 years. And for many of those years, he was virtually unknown in the world, practicing in a very remote place in Brazil, in the state of Goiás, which is central Brazil, near the capital, Brasilia. And he comes from a tradition of Brazilian Umbanda. Now, this will surprise many of your listeners who know John of God because he calls himself a good Catholic. Now that I've said he's a good Catholic, I have to explain to your listeners that out of the maybe 17, 18 times I've been to Brazil, and of course now, Tanya, my wife, is Brazilian, so I've learned a bit about the culture. Brazilians innately seem to accept mediumship and spirituality differently than Americans, and I think it has to do with the way the country of Brazil was founded. So for John of God to be a medium in a small town in Brazil practicing healing would not be that out of the ordinary. Now, of course, we had our own Edgar Cayce, but the Edgar Cayces of the United States are far and few between. Where in Brazil, there are literally hundreds, if not thousands, of mediums. And then there's an actual cultural philosophy and science that supports them called Spiritism. And one who, of course, studies Spiritism is a Spiritist. Brazil today, on last count, has over 20 million practicing Spiritists, with spiritual centers sometimes as large as a city block. I visited one in Brasilia that had over 220 classrooms where they study things like trance mediumship, materialization, healing, channeling, throughout different days of the week. So with that said, this is what the culture of Brazil accepts. But there are also many of them Catholics. So it would be certainly ordinary for someone to go to Mass on Sunday and then to go to their Spiritist center or perhaps an Umbanda center in the middle of the week during the evening. And the Brazilians don't see a conflict with that. So I think the level of which they accept the cultural aspect of mediumship and religion as one and together, I think is absolutely awesome. And so
It sounds like we all need to go and live there, Greg.
Americans
It's hot as well, isn't it? The weather's good.
Yes, the weather's good. It gets a little hot in the summer. So back to John of God. He is a trance medium who's well known there, and then in the last 15 years he became extremely well known in the world because people started going there and writing books about him, putting up websites. Even Oprah Winfrey took a trip to see John of God in 2012. And the Brazilians tell me that once Oprah went to visit John of God, then even more Brazilians know about him because Oprah is very famous in Brazil. And so all of this, of course, is tied in with the internet and media, including your own radio show, how the world is becoming a smaller place. So you've had many, many people travel to see John of God. Now, I've called him a trance medium. Why is it that he's also a healer? Because Spiritists believe that the phenomena of healing is a subset of mediumship, and that the really great healings that happen with the assistance of what they call the good spirits. And so they even break it down further than this. Mediumship is actually, as you know, many of your listeners and many of you on the show are mediums. There's a particular type of mediumship called physical effects mediumship, which is where one can channel not only the energy and ectoplasm of their own body, but also the energy of nature and also spirit world. And so John of God is a physical effects mediumship who specializes in healing. And if that would be the best way I could describe him.
Well, Greg, I want to ask you, why is it that mediumship is so deeply entrenched in Brazilian culture? What is different about Brazil that causes the Brazilians to be so more accepting of mediumship?
You know, that's a great question, Steve, and I want your listeners to be patient with me because I'm somewhat opinionated, and so a lot of this comes from my opinion. So I'm going to tell you my opinion, then I also invite your listeners to go and to also make their own study of Brazil, because one thing's for sure, Brazilians accept mediumship wholeheartedly. Now, my opinion is this. Brazil and the United States, the two countries were founded around the same time in history. Of course, in the United States, we had the English coming over, and we had people fleeing England for freedom of religion. But the interesting thing about the United States is that the people that came to have freedom of religion, once they got to the United States, they imposed their strict religious beliefs on others that were here, including the Indians. And so the United States, although it's legally free, and we do have an incredible constitution and great laws, culturally, for many years, the United States was not feeling free of religion. In fact, many of the spiritualists who first started practicing mediumship in the mid-1800s did so behind what we say closed doors. Now, the reason why Brazil is different because the Portuguese came to Brazil and they weren't interested in settling Brazil. What they really cared about was the gold and the natural resources and growing sugarcane and getting money. And many of them went to Brazil and then went back to Europe. Some of the ones that stayed, it's my understanding, had large plantations, and accidentally, some of the slave women from Africa that they imported to Brazil, just like the Americans did, some of the slave women became pregnant from the Portuguese. Well, the Portuguese men did something nice. Typically, they would move them into the house, and the next question was from some of these African women was, we'd like to be free to practice our religion. So what they would do is they would build temples on the land of the large plantations. And so there was a freedom of the slaves from Africa to practice their spirit-based religions. And since there wasn't an agenda to form any religious agenda in Brazil, over the years as the country developed, it socially remained a very free place for religious ideals and experiences. So you see, you had a background of which there were religions that were operating in Brazil that were spirit-based. And then you had the Catholics and you had Christians. And then something else interesting happening in the 1850s is you had the advent of Spiritism in Paris, France. And that's a very important point in history. The same thing happened in the United States. We had spiritualism also with the Fox sisters who had experienced phenomena, and they made international news also in the 1850s. But you see, in France, they had a man named Allan Kardec who created what's called the doctrine of Spiritism. Now, most people aren't aware, but if you were a wealthy Brazilian in the late 1800s, you spoke French because that was the international language, and you went to Paris to shop. And so what happened? The wealthy Brazilians went to Paris, learned about Spiritism, brought the Spirits book and the Doctrine of Spiritism back to Brazil, and this gave an intellectual reason for now we understand how we can accept from an intellectual standpoint the practice of talking with spirits. And so this gave Brazil a more credible way to explain the phenomenon. And so from there, in the last couple hundred years, it's now grown to 20 million spiritists in Brazil. And if you're not there experiencing the culture, it might be hard to imagine that you literally could go to the nation's capital in Brasilia and visit a center that has 200 classrooms in spirituality. I mean, can you imagine such a center in Washington, D.C. here?
It sounds amazing. I have to go. It's on my list of places to visit for sure, Greg. And well, Greg, I want to ask you more about John of God. So, my understanding is that John of God is a psychic surgeon. Is that correct?
It is correct. And that word is a word that's that people use, and it's confusing to people. And there are also different types of psychic surgery. But to be specific with some of your listeners who maybe don't know about John of God, I'll explain it. What he typically does, he practices his healing 3 times a week, on Wednesdays, Thursdays, and Fridays. There's a morning session and an afternoon session. Many times, and not every time, during the beginning of one of the healing sessions, he will come out front, address the crowd, and then he'll say a prayer that he'll go into trance. When he does go into trance, his voice is markedly different. The energy around him is different. And anyone who's there experiencing it, even a disbeliever, would say, hey, something is dramatically different with him. Now, if the conditions are correct and they have volunteers, they'll bring one of the volunteers up front, and he will do some sort of a psychic surgery. But in his case, he uses actual medical instruments. As a matter of fact, my wife Tanya was a volunteer there for 1 year and used to hold a tray of the instruments. And my first trip there, I was literally 10 feet away, standing in the front, and I watched one of these incredible surgeries where he made an incision about 1.5 inches, 2 inches long into the flesh of a person. They did not bleed. They did not seem to feel pain. I could see the flesh open, and he reached in with his fingers and pulled out what looked like to appear to be a small tumor, which, of course, he then flipped on the floor, and another person came quickly and mopped it up. They work like clockwork there. It's amazing. And then he took what looked like normal suture and literally took 3 or 4 stitches and closed the wound, and then they took her away to the back where she relaxed in the recovery room. So that
Wow.
would be a typical psychic surgery with John of God, but he actually does use a scalpel.
Have you ever had a psychic surgery, Greg?
Yes, I have. I've had a psychic surgery, and it's interesting. I lined up and I volunteered there, and my psychic surgery with John of God was that he rushed at me and took his hand and put so much energy in my heart that when they laid me down on the table, my hands were still 6 inches off the table for the next 15 minutes because I was like stiff as a board from the energy. But I felt such peace. It was an amazing feeling of peace and energy at the same time. So my psychic surgery there did not involve the scalpel. However, I have seen a psychic surgery from the Philippines. And, of course, this has happened in the last 2 years. And that surgery was amazing because he gave me a series of surgeries where his hand pulled some tissue out from the back of my neck. I have an injured back. He worked on my back, and he pulled mucus and stuff out from inside my back. And now, when he was working on me, I could not see what he was doing, but I did have the opportunity to observe him work on others. And it was amazing. He did not need to use a scalpel. And when he pressed on the flesh, it would appear to open, and I even saw him remove a small tumor from a woman's breast. I saw the flesh open. He pulled it out, and then it closed, and then it was left with a red mark that then she said went away the next day. And so this type of phenomena does happen in different parts of the world, and it's usually different depending on the culture and the tradition. And then what even confuses us more is not only does it happen, but then sometimes there are people that say they do it, and then they don't. And then you have a situation where people are committing fraud, and then someone discovers it, and that gives the whole thing a bad name. So it's a very, very complicated phenomenon.
Well, it just sounds incredible. Really does sound incredible. So you met your wife through your engagement with the John of God group. Is that correct?
It is correct, and we try not to talk about ourselves too much, but what a perfect time to share this story because it is Valentine's Day, and Tanya is indeed the love of my life. And the story is, if you had asked me 10 years ago if any of this could have been possible, or if explained to me this was going to happen, I would have told you were crazy. But imagine here I am in Brazil, in 2003, not expecting to be there. And then all of a sudden I started experiencing phenomena, hearing voices, having energy around my hands. And so I spent the next 2 years reading, studying books, and I sat in a mediumship development circle with the Spiritist in Bethesda, Maryland. And lo and behold, I went back in 2005 in December, and I had been a handful of times, so I knew a lot of the people at the Casa in the small town. People knew me by name, and it was a great getaway for me in a time when I had a very difficult business to run and a lot on my mind, and I was single. I was a bit lonely. And so here I was in Brazil again, one more trip. And the first day there, I noticed that there was a new person standing up front with John of God. And I thought, well, I wonder who this is. And I thought, she's kind of cute, and she has a really pretty voice. Well, she didn't speak but about 3 words of English, and those 3 words were, close your eyes. And you see, her job was, she was the director of the current room. She would say the opening prayer, she would make sure the energy was pure and good, and she would literally maintain the feeling of this vibration and tranquility in the current room so that he could do his work. And so one of the rules there is that they want you to sit there with your eyes closed so that you can more focus on helping to create and generate this current, this human vital energy, and then also that you won't be distracting anyone or even yourself. So when I laid my eyes on her, the first thing I wanted to do was stare at her. So I kept trying to look at Tanya, and then she kept coming telling me in broken English, close your eyes. So that was our first experience together. And during the break, I went up to her and tried to talk to her, and she let me know right away she didn't speak English. And then I tried to speak the broken Spanish that I'd learned in high school and college, and she told me she didn't speak a word of Spanish. And so I was about ready to give up. And then the next day, I asked her if I could walk her home. And it's a cute little town. And we're talking about a town with a dirt road down the main street and roosters running around on a horse in the field. And so there's a group of people walking in her direction. And I understand now in Portuguese, she told me, well, I could walk if I want to. She couldn't stop me. And so I began to walk with her home, and I noticed the further we got, the more willing she was to try to communicate with me in Spanish. And by the way, I've since learned that Tanya did speak very good Spanish in that point, so she could understand everything I was saying. And we get near to where her house was, which was probably about a mile down the road, and all of a sudden it's one of these incredible South American Brazilian storms. You know, 1 minute the sun's out, pretty blue sky, and then within 2 minutes the clouds come and the sky is dark, and you hear thunder, and then it is raining like cats and dogs. So she looks at me, and she just couldn't have the heart to send me away by myself in the rain, so she let me come in. Now, waiting in the house were 2 of her good friends, and that was our first real date, because we spent probably 4 or 5 hours talking with her 2 friends in the living room of her house, playing dominoes, trying to communicate in broken Spanish and Portuguese. And then the next weekend we went out. We had a couple days together in her hometown of Caldas Novas, and then we've been together ever since. And then we arranged for her to get a tourist visa, and then we got married here in the United States, and that was in 2008.
Well, it's a wonderful story of two people being brought together by spirits and their interest in spirits. And so I'm interested to ask you how you discovered your mediumistic ability.
Well, it was, as I mentioned, it happens through having these experiences. And, for me, I was honestly, I have to share with your listeners, I was definitely a born skeptic. I remember when I first came to California in the early 1980s, and every other person here, would ask you, what's your sign? And I just thought, what does that mean? I mean, I did not have a clue. I was just a guy who was interested in business and material world things, and also, a bit of the arts, as I'm into music. But I just did not have a passion for the spiritual arts. Now, I see the fact that I was sort of a born skeptic and not having a liberal attitude toward this being a big plus for me. Now, why is that? Because the experiences that happened to me and the psychic surgery that I saw and the phenomena that I've witnessed, and the list goes on since then, including full materializations, this, because of my initial skeptic attitude, this gave me the desire, the burning desire to want to study and try to find out to the best of my ability the truth behind the phenomena and also how it works. And so it's led me to build some incredible friendships around the world, to some wonderful books. And so that's why I talk and give classes to tell other people, because, we have a saying with spiritual work, just because you don't believe it doesn't mean that it's not true. And I'm living proof of that. And remember, one of the prime philosophies behind both spiritualism here in the United States and Spiritism in Brazil is that this phenomena, whether it be hearing voices or seeing spirits or having a materialization where a spirit apports an item into a room, or whether there's a healing, what this does, this brings all of us proof that when the body perishes, that our soul still survives. Because I think most of us can agree in universal law that if one spirit can live after their body perishes and be in the spirit world and have communication with us, well, we must be able to do that too. And so, with me, the mediumship started with the experience of what I call unexplained phenomena that I could not explain and I knew was real. And then I had periods of this next year from 2003 to 2004 where I would have things happen and I would still ask for proof. And for example, the very first experience at the Casa was the first day there, as I was, to make a long story short, the first day there, John of God had the spirit of King Solomon with him, who hadn't been with him for 18 years. And King Solomon is the one who saw me standing out front watching the surgery and raised his hand and looked at me and said, "You," like a king, and sent me back to the back to work with John of God. And while I was sitting there, I began to hear a voice that explained to me how I could imagine with my third eye, how I could imagine that I was forming balls of brilliant white light on each of my hands. And, I'm literally sitting there hitting the side of my head with my hand going, what is this? Am I really hearing this? And I really didn't believe. Sometimes you see something or experience something that's so fantastic that it's hard for you to believe and accept. So I was in this period of not accepting. So I went through these series of experiences there at the Casa, and then 2.5, 3 weeks later, on the way home, I grabbed a handful of books from the bookstore there, and I was reading one on the plane on the way home, and it was from a woman who takes tour guides to Brazil, and she's also a practicing healer. And in one of her chapters of the book, she describes how she was sitting there in the current room at John of God, and the spirits taught her how to make these balls of light on her hand. And when I read those pages, I got what we call goosebumps, and I thought, wow, this really happened to me, because here I'm reading in the book, the same thing happened to this woman as well. And it had happened to her I think 3, 4, 5 years before. And I didn't read her book until after it happened to me. So I think it's important for all of us to keep an open mind, but also be discerning, but then look for ways to prove the phenomena that you're experiencing. Because once you have that proof, what it does, it also builds faith, and then it makes the phenomena and the spiritual work you do even stronger. Now, in religion, we say it's a great thing to have blind faith, but I think it's a greater thing to have a faith that's based on experience and knowledge and education. And for those who are interested, there are incredible resources around the world you can study and learn, other teachers, where you can gain a lot of experience. And it's amazing when you ask and when you tell Spirit that you're interested in this phenomena. I'm sure all of those on the panel here and your listeners can count a lot of stories where all of a sudden things start to happen to them. Someone gives them a book, or someone calls them, or they meet someone else new. And so there's no shortage of help when someone really sincerely, for the right reasons, wants to learn about mediumship. And now, what would be a right reason? The right reason would be the reason to do good, to help others.
Absolutely, Greg. We always say the same, that it's about contributing. And I want to ask you in a moment after our commercial break about some of the resources that you recommend for people that want to learn more about mediumship and channeling. So we'll take a short commercial break, Greg, and we'll continue the conversation.
A new era in psychic services has begun. PsychicAccess.com. You can connect with our psychic advisors by telephone or chat 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. All of our psychic advisors are interviewed, fully verified, and accuracy tested, assuring you quality service. We're living in some very troubled times right now. More and more, the world's problems are affecting us on a personal level. You don't have to deal with this alone. Our highly accurate psychics, caring advisors, and talented mediums can help with situations you are currently experiencing and can let you know what the future may hold for you. All new customers get a free 6-minute reading. All you have to do is register. Why not visit us now and get a free reading at PsychicAccess.com.
Of the right information.
Well, Greg, welcome back. I want to ask you just briefly, Greg, about the resources you recommend for people that want to learn more about mediumship. And then I want to ask you about the different forms of the phenomena that you've experienced.
Okay, well, there's three genres of resources in the United States. And as I start to talk about this with your listeners, please have patience with me, because remember, we all have our own experiences, our own opinions, and we only know what we've learned. So surely when I talk about one resource, I'm going to be leaving out many others that I don't know about yet. And also, when I do make statements about one thing, it doesn't mean that it's better than the other thing. And that's one thing I've learned. I've really learned in this study to be open. I mean, I went from a place of not understanding what's your sign in 1981 to having a great respect now for astrology. And so this is what we all need to do to come together. Now, with that said, one of the resources that's been here in the United States since, of course, the 1850s would be the spiritualist churches. And I believe there's 400 to 500 small spiritualist churches around the United States in different associations. And there are small churches that are generally set up with mediumship as a focus of the church. Now, with that said, obviously some would be better than other ones, and some mediums at some of these churches would be willing or better teachers than others. One thing I have learned in the United States, that too many people that practice great mediumship are interested in giving readings and doing the work, but many times it doesn't seem like they're willing to share what it is they know. Now, that's not everybody. And sometimes people are just too busy, and they're not teachers. They focus on doing the work. So, but one venue, of course, would be the spiritualist churches. With that said, there's a large handful of books that have been written since the 1850s that are associated with the spiritualist churches. Now, the other group would be the group that is strong in Brazil, the Spiritists. That would be Spiritism. And what the Spiritists bring to the study is that they have, in Brazil, they have literally thousands of books. But in the last 15 years, they've been working like little beavers to translate as many books as they can to English, and they make them available here at a very reasonable cost. In fact, some of their books you can download online for free. So the spiritualists are very fair in that they don't really charge a lot of money for what they do. They're all nonprofit, and their major goal is to disseminate information about Spiritism, which is one of the best studies of the phenomena of mediumship. So you have the Spiritists here, and you can search Spiritism or you can search Spiritualism on the Internet, and you'll find a lot of resources. Now, the other third genre would be what I would call the more secular genres. You know, in California, we have the Berkeley Psychic Institute, or you have other various psychic sorts of institutes, you know, in the United States, including the one, I think, in Virginia that used to teach remote viewing and some of those things. So what they have in common is, to some degree or the other, they all teach or explain or give the attendee a chance to experience some form of either psychic phenomena and or mediumship. But now that we say psychic phenomena or mediumship, did you know, Steve, up until the past couple of years, I have not even been able to get a good explanation in what the difference is between a psychic or a medium. And sometimes people call themselves psychics and mediums. So I've generally coined my own interpretation and explanation, and of course I certainly would prompt your listeners if they can add to this or have any ideas. I'd certainly like to hear from them. But psychic phenomena is something that we as individuals, our soul, our spirit, our energy field, it's certain skills that we have that can be developed. And those skills could be, for example, remote viewing, being able to, for our soul, being able to temporarily feel like it's leaving our body and going to another location and looking at things. Or being able to sort of receive some type of messages from the future. This sort of thing would be a psychic phenomena. And then, of course, there's physical psychic phenomena, people that, can claim that they can move things with the power of their mind. Now, what's interesting is that the meditations and the methods and the energy by which someone grows and increases their psychic phenomena, they're almost virtually the same and puts your chakras in your body in the same condition for being able to have contact with the spirits. And this would explain what a medium does. In fact, most people are not aware that the word medium was actually coined and created by Allan Kardec, the founder of Spiritism in Paris, France in the 1850s. He actually came up with that word. And what it is, a medium is someone who's a go-between, the midpoint between the spirit world and our world. So it's someone who can communicate with a spirit. So I'm hesitant to say, but it's my opinion that many people that call themselves psychics are indeed psychic, but they also have contact with the spirits. And some know it and some don't. Some people actually know it, but they're reticent to tell. So if you are a medium and you can have contact with the spirits, there's a good chance, by definition of that fact, that you also have psychic abilities, because it's those psychic gifts that put you in the space to begin with that would allow contact with the spirits. Does that make sense? And do you agree, Steve?
Absolutely, I do. I think it's a great explanation, and I often use the same description of the medium being in between two states. So I often describe a medium as being a little bit like a radio receiving set, receiving
Exactly.
signals and then transmitting them out to be understood by another party.
And not to say is something's happened in the United States, I think, within the last 10 years. As a matter of fact, someone recently gave me a book that John Edward wrote. He's the famous medium here in the United States, and he, after all his years in his career, said he finally decided to write a book on psychic phenomena and mediumship, and I thought it was quite good. And he said he'd been reluctant to write such a book because he did not want to open up the idea with people that they could go from reading his book one minute and out there to charging $200 for reading the next minute. And this begs another whole question about what it is to be psychic. What do you do with the gifts? I certainly don't criticize, or I'm certainly not for anyone not against anyone charging. But the point is that under everything that you do, there needs to be this desire to be of service and to help others. And a lot of times, people start out, they want to push the cart before the horse. For example, I've had a friend who has been involved in Spiritism here in the U.S., and they said, some of our attendees went to see a great Spiritist speaker, and they were so amazed by it that after they'd been to 2 months of classes, they said, okay, I want to be a great speaker. Or someone came to the mediumship circle, and after their first time, they sensed a little something or they thought something, and then they said, okay, I want to go start reading cards and setting up my shingle on my website next week. What I've found is that the really, truly great mediums and the people that are out there either healing or giving these incredible messages or helping others that become well known, their notoriety and their celebrity status happens because of a life well lived, because of the service that they've done, because of the mediumship they have, some of the books they've written. We have mediums in Brazil. There's one man still alive today in the 70s, Divaldo Franco, who's written over 200 books, and most all of them psychographed, which means automatic writing. And so it's natural for him to go around the world speaking and giving large lectures. Sometimes I think he's spoken over 14,000 times in 52 countries. That makes sense because that comes out of the fact of his work, of his mediumship, and all the books he's written. So what I found in my own journey is that ask and you shall receive. For people there that sincerely want to develop these gifts, as soon as the sincere notion is in their heart, within days they will have either a new book, or someone will tell them about a class, or they'll find a website, or they'll meet a network of people, and then they'll start this path of developing these gifts. And a lot of people ask me all the time, Greg, how can I do what you do? They come to our healing circle and they hear one of my spirits speaking in Portuguese, or we have an Englishman speaking with an English accent, and they want to do that. And what I tell them is, it is possible. There are some that will tell you that if you're not a child-born medium, forget it. Just like the movie The Sixth Sense, you have to have these experiences when you're a child, and if you don't have that, you can't do it. I don't agree with that. Now, while I will say that some of the most incredible mediums in the world did have these gifts when they were children, it is certainly possible, and there certainly are many, many other amazing mediums that develop them over time. And the best way to do this is in what we call the development circle. And that would be a group of, 6, 7, 8, 10 to 15 people that sit in a circle and help each other develop these gifts.
So can you tell us, Greg, about your personal experiences of trance?
Okay. One thing that I do now, there's different ways to get into trance. I've seen some incredible meetings. One named David Thompson from Australia, who's an Englishman who does amazing physical effects. Spirits actually appear in the room with him. He uses music. He'll usually have 2 or 3 songs that they'll play quite loudly, and the songs are both a trigger for his own mind, and they're also a reminder to the spirits around him that it's time to go to trance. And he'll reach different levels of trance through the cues of music. I also know a medium in Brazil, Maria Gertrudis, who's one of those amazing mediumistic painters. She can paint with the spirits of the Impressionism from France, namely Joseph Turner, who will paint paintings through her fingers, and she'll paint an entire oil canvas in 4 to 5 minutes. And it's an amazing phenomenon. If anyone has a chance to see her, I recommend it. But when she starts, she'll close her eyes, and they'll put music on for her, and usually within 1 minute to 2 minutes, she's in trance, and the spirit's with her. And what I do is very similar to what I learned in Brazil at La Casa with John of God. What I do is I have a couple of prayers, one even in Portuguese, that can put my mind to a place where I've experienced the phenomena, many times over. And so it helps me get to a place in my mind where my mind is at rest without thought, but also at a high state of energy. Trance mediumship is not something you do while you're resting. Now, there's many different facets of it, and one of the reasons why I tell the Americans that what the Brazilians do is unique is because America, the traditions of the spiritualist mediums here, comes from Western Europe. And I know, Steve, you being from Europe, you probably could relate to this. A lot of times they'll sit you around the table and they'll say, okay, place your hands flat down the table and don't leave your chair. And you'll sit around the group and the energy will come up, and some people will start to practice and they'll have a little channeling happening. But the way I do it is what I learned because I learned in Brazil. I do it standing on my feet. And this is the Brazilian tradition that came from Umbanda, because they would raise the energy not only through music, but the mediums would stand on their feet. In fact, the music sometimes was very primitive. It was drumming. drumming and samba music. But at the end of the day, you have to raise the energy, but at the same time, relax your mind, which seems like a dichotomy. On the one minute, you're supposed to raise energy, in the same minute, you're supposed to relax. But I found that it's this push of energy with taking my own thoughts out of the picture, which is the hardest part for me, by the way, that allows the space where the spirit can come through and I can receive and experience the phenomenon of trance mediumship. Does that make any sense?
It does, absolutely. And I want to ask you, I did some trance mediumship in the UK when I was involved in the Spiritualist National Union, or the Spiritualist
Uh-huh.
Church network, as you mentioned
Uh-huh.
before. And I always find trance really fascinating because even just doing telepathic mediumship, when somebody in spirit draws really close, I can feel the
Hmm.
calling signs. And then in trance, I
Exactly.
feel a lot of physical sensation, almost as though my face and hands change, they feel different. What's your experience?
Absolutely. It is very much like that. People tell me that my face actually can look different. I'm naturally, I'm told now, I'm naturally a medium of physical effects. And the Brazilians, this was identified in a spiritual center in called the Frei Luís Center near Rio de Janeiro, where they do materializations. This is a person whose body has a lot of ectoplasm. And I've just recently learned from David Thompson that the ectoplasm in the human body, he believes through science, is produced in the pancreas. Now, the ectoplasm, for your listeners who don't know what it is, it's like a gaseous, semi-solid gas quasi-liquid that almost looks like a white cloud. And the ectoplasm becomes more dense when the lights are low and when the temperature is cooler. And so, in my case, on many times, the ectoplasm will come up through my body and it will come to my voice box, and you can actually hear it sometimes gurgling, almost sounds like phlegm, and that helps the spirits create a different type of voice box so that my voice will actually change the tone and character. And so, again, there's many, many different types of trance mediumship. I know trance mediums that do it, that draw the spirit in, and they go into a relatively deep trance, but when they talk, it's their own voice, but it's still the thoughts of the spirit, and they're not getting in the way. And then there are other trance mediums, like, for example, my wife, Tanya. She's what we call an unconscious trance medium. When she goes into trance, and she'll stay in trance in our healing circles for over 2 hours. It's an amazing phenomenon. And, she grew up doing this, so she's been doing this her whole life, but she will not have any memory, virtually no memory, of what went on during the trance when she comes back out of it. And she's walking around, she's talking, she's telling people things, she's giving advice to people, and of course, doing the healing work. In my case, I am more of a conscious trance medium in that I'll remember roughly 60 to 75% of what went on. Sometimes it'll feel like I'm far away and I can just barely hear it, and then sometimes I'm a little what we call too conscious, because you don't want to be too conscious if you're a person like me who wants to learn and to witness and to see, because then all of a sudden you wake up and then your ability to be with spirit will go away. So you have to learn how to step and stand out of the way. Do you understand?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Have you experienced the ectoplasm?
Yes, and boy, all of these questions beg 3 more stories. I have a picture of us sitting in a circle with the ectoplasm coming out of my mouth, but the lights weren't dim enough. And the one caveat I'll say about the work with ectoplasm, you want to make sure that you're in an environment that's safe, where the doors will remain closed, where you can keep the temperature cool, and where you can keep the lights low. Because if you're in a position where you had a materialization, which is where a spirit forms using the ectoplasm in the room, and a lot of ectoplasm leaves your body, at the end of the seance, the ectoplasm needs to return to the body. And there was a case, I think, in England, and I can never remember these names, where a famous medium was doing a seance, and they had a spirit materialized in the room, and the police came in and shined on the lights and broke it up and put her in jail. And the ectoplasm, with a strong spotlights was burned, and it couldn't return to her body, and she died 2 days later. And so you do not see a lot of material mediumship work happening, particularly in the United States. When I participated in the material mediumship work in Rio de Janeiro, they were very, very careful, and it's a beautiful phenomenon. So for you to have success, you have to find people who have this innate ability and form a small group and do it in a safe place with the lights low, and make sure during the seance that you don't have to worry about someone turning the lights on. And so we've had a couple development circles start, but I'm sure that those of you who have experience with this, and Steve, you as well, many times you'll start a circle, some people will drop out or they'll lose interest, or then one medium gets jealous of the other one or something happens, and then lo and behold, you don't have a success. The development-ship circles for physical mediumship, the ones that have success, go on for sometimes even a number of years with the same people who have a commitment to experiencing this type of work. Now, this would have been a lot easier to do in the 1800s when you didn't have internet, didn't have television. The lights were always off at night because you didn't have electric light. So it's challenging to find a group of people that really want to sit and do physical mediumship now in this society.
It's true. I think that we're impatient. We expect things so quickly. And as you said, in the 1800s, people sat for years to develop just the energy that would allow them to experience physical mediumship. Well, Greg, I'm so grateful for you coming on our show on Valentine's Day. It's been wonderful to have you with us. You're a great speaker, and you're obviously doing really beneficial work. I want to thank you for joining us this evening.
It's been a great pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Greg. Stay in touch. Hopefully we're having your wife on the show as well in a couple of months, so we'll look forward to that.
That will be wonderful. Everyone, please be well and be with the peace of God.
Thank you very much, Greg. You too. And thank you for all the good work you do.
Hello, my name is Res Miranda. If you're having relationship, career, or life issues, I'm inviting you to experience what it's like to have access to professional, highly accurate psychics and spiritual advisors you can trust to care and help you. Register now to get your free 6-minute reading by telephone or chat. Get answers, get access, psychic access, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. PsychicAccess.com.